This is the first in a series on one of the most, you could say, the most foundational or fundamental of all Buddhist or Dharma teachings, the Four Noble Truths. If you've been involved in the meditation, or you could say Buddhist or Dharma world for any length of time, you will be exposed to many discussions and teachings, talks on the Four Noble Truths. And it can be approached in a way that can sometimes feel quite simple. I would argue that it can be confoundingly simple, and there's actually a lot of subtlety and layers to it. So we're going to, over the course of this series, approach the Four Noble Truths from many, many different levels to try to really tease apart really quite a range and subtlety of meanings and ways we can apply it into our own practice. So I'm going to be using some Pali here. You don't need to know the Pali language, but I find it's useful because when we translate, even though I think translators sincerely do the best they can, you're always bringing a particular connotation to how we translate it in English. And as you'll see in just a bit, especially when we get into the First Noble Truth, the meaning of some of the words, if we want to understand what the Pali's really saying, and that will help get down to the kind of the root understanding of what we're getting at. So let me start by just talking about briefly through the Four Noble Truths, and a way that it's commonly taught that I think can sometimes have some misconceptions. The First Noble Truth, sometimes people have heard it as the Buddha saying, life is suffering. And that's inaccurate. We'll come back and see that. Certainly the First Noble Truth is talking about a lot of that there is a truth of suffering in our lives, but it doesn't quite say life is suffering. In fact, we all know that when you're having a pleasant time, when life's going your way, and it's not suffering. So we want to kind of unpack what is it really getting to. And then the second noble truth sometimes also, I think, is mistranslated. People can think it means the cause of our suffering is desire. And, we're supposed to somehow transcend desires, or get rid of all desires, not have any desires. And that's not quite accurate either. We'll come back and talk more about what it's really talking about. And then the third noble truth is that there is an end to our suffering. And again, people will think it means if we can end desires. So we want to understand what that really means. And then the fourth noble truth is what's called the Eightfold Path. It's a progression of practices and qualities we cultivate. It includes meditative practices, living an ethical life. It's got 8 elements to it, so we can actualize the benefits and the understanding of the Four Noble Truths, so that we live from a place where it's more alive for us in our moment-to-moment experience. So let me then come back to this first noble truth and really try to get a good understanding of what it's talking about. I mentioned just a few moments ago that people think it means, sometimes people hear that the cause, that life is suffering. What it's really saying is that life, there's a particular word in Pali, dukkha, and the meaning of dukkha, it includes suffering, but if you go to the root meaning of the word, getting into the etymology of dukkha, it actually has the meaning of a cart. The axle on the wheel is out of round. It's kind of got a jiggle or looseness in the axle there. Well, what happens if you ride on a cart where the axle's loose like that? You're going to get a bumpy ride. So what the first noble truth is really saying is not that life is suffering. It's really saying life is a bumpy ride, if you want to think of it like that. the the ways that I tend to use the term, I mean, say bumpy ride, but I say it that life has an element of uncertainty to it, unreliable. You can't count on. We all know that we're trying to, whether you're conscious of it or not. I think all human beings want to create your circumstances such that you have more and more pleasant experience and less unpleasant. No one's trying to have more of what you don't want happen. I mean, it sounds ridiculous, and have less of what you want happen. And we can, sometimes we can affect circumstances, of course, but we know despite our best efforts, sometimes you get what you want, sometimes you don't, and sometimes you get what you don't want. So this is this aspect of how life is with dukkha. And the whole point is, if you don't have a problem with the bumpy ride, it's not actually suffering. This is where we bring in a place of equanimity. But as we all know, lots of things happen that we do have a problem with. And that's where the suffering comes in. I'm reminded of a quote from one of my very first teachers. I began my practice in the Buddhist world in the mid-1970s. But before that, for about 5 years, I started my meditation practice in 1970 in a Hindu-oriented yoga tradition. And again, I was in that for about 5 years. I lived in an ashram yoga meditation center for a couple of years. And then in the mid-70s, transitioned into the Buddhist world. And one of my first teachers in the yoga tradition was a man named Hari Das. He was the founding teacher for here in California, near in the Santa Cruz area. There's a center that's still there called the Mount Madonna Center. If you want to look him up, he was quite an amazing teacher. And there's a quote from him that I really love, and I'll share it with you to try to get to the idea of what we're really talking about with this First Noble Truth. He's using different language because he's coming from this yogic tradition. So the language is a little different, but I think it really gets to the same heart as what Buddhist Dharma is trying to point to. And I can give you the quote. This isn't exact, but I think my memory's pretty close. He said, we live our entire existence from really a single point of view, trying to get more experiences we want and less experiences we don't want. That's just what I just mentioned a few moments ago. And he goes on to say, we live our entire existence from this point of view. And then he says, but despite our best efforts, even when the situation seems ideal to us, there is always the nagging certainty that the happiness and security of the moment will change. And he says, in fact, we are never totally at peace. There is always something to worry about. Ordinary life is really a constant dilemma. So I'll just pause there. There's a little more in the quote. But that's kind of the starting point, is to take a look at, well, what is our experience actually like? Is it true that there's always something to worry about? It's an invitation for each of us to look and see. Is it true that there's always something to worry about? We're never totally at peace. Ordinary life is really a constant dilemma. So one of the things that it's an invitation, if you've never done the experiment, I'll just offer it up. Take a few minutes, an hour, part of a day, a whole day, longer, and just pay attention and notice your mind. What percentage of time are you at peace? How much of the time is there some kind of worry or agitation? And I think if you're like many people, maybe most people, we see that at least a fair amount of the time there's what's going on in our mind is some version of I'm not okay. Am I okay? I'm not okay. Am I going to be okay? How am I going to be okay? There are things that we're worried or anxious, or that kind of thinking's going on in our minds a lot. So you'll have to see how much that is for you. Um, Sometimes it can happen that as people start to meditate and their mindfulness and their self awareness strengthens, it can actually feel like things are getting worse sometimes. And what can be happening is that we start to notice more of what was always going on, but we hadn't had so much awareness about it. So we're more attuned to what's really going on. And sometimes it can be rather horrifying to really see what's going on in our minds. Obviously, that's hopefully, it depends on each of us how that is, but I hope for most of us that's not the whole story. But it can be if we go through times like that, if we're dealing with chronic depression, anxiety, traumas, it can feel that way. But I think for all of us, at least some percentage, maybe a lot of the time, it can be we start to notice. But this isn't, I hope if we want to learn to liberate our hearts and minds, we would want to start noticing what's actually going on as the starting point. The Four Noble Truths doesn't leave us stuck here. It's giving us a way out, that there's an end. But first we have to notice what's actually going on. So that can be kind of a starting point for us. Hari Das's quote, he also does not leave us there. He adds then that spiritual life, spiritual practice, as Buddhists we could say Dharma practice, meditation, it's learning how to live life as free, conscious, and loving beings instead of from the point of view of dilemma. So let me just say that again. So I resonate with that way of articulating it a lot. Perhaps you like that too, but let me just say it again. Our Dharma practice, our meditative practice, is about learning to live as free, conscious, and loving beings instead of from the point of view of dilemma. So one of the questions for us then is, what is that, if that sounds good to you, what does it mean to live life in such a way? And what can help us deepen that? Because let's just say you hear these words of Hari Das and you think, wow, that sounds great. I'm going to sign up for that. I'm going to just, stop creating all the suffering in my mind and learn to let go more. And well, you'll have times when you can do it, but what you notice is a lot of the times you just can't do it. All it takes is the right causes and conditions, the right circumstances to come along, and you're caught right back in again in your reactivity. So most of us need some help. This is where all the meditation practices come in. That's what we'll be talking about further down the road, especially in the Eightfold Path. That's the fourth element of the Four Noble Truths, which really explicitly lays out a path of practice to help us both be more aware more of the time what's going on, but actually naturally have a lot of these reactive patterns kind of let go and heal up in our minds. So that's kind of where all this is aiming. So the starting point is, one way it's thought about is, I'll come back to the First Noble Truth in a minute, but one way that people think of the Four Noble Truths is, you can think of it's kind of like getting a diagnosis from a physician. The first is diagnosing what the problem is. There is dukkha, you could say suffering, that's fine. Life is a bumpy ride. We can all agree on that. The second is, what's the cause of the problem? The third noble truth is that there is an end to this and it's a cure. And then the fourth is actually, what is the medicine? What are the steps we take for that cure? So that's the way to think of it. So here we are on the first noble truth, and let me just add in a little more. So in the next session, I'm going to unpack this a little bit more about how this dukkha turns into suffering. We can spend a little time hanging out here, exploring it. And the first noble truth, I'm not going to get into that right now. Next session, but the basic idea is to think when challenges come, the dukkha, the uncertainty, the inevitable ups and downs of life come. I mentioned earlier, if we're okay with it, it's actually not suffering. This is why it's not accurate to think that the Buddha is saying, or Buddhism is saying, life is suffering. Again, it's more that life has uncertainty, or you could say it can be a bumpy ride. It has ups and downs, right? That's really what it's saying. If we're okay with it, we aren't suffering, right? And we all know that there will be places in life where we are okay, where difficulties come and we let it go and we move on and we deal with it, and right. And we also know that there's plenty of areas in life where we do get caught, we are suffering, and it can be quite challenging. And those are the areas that then we're being invited to find ways. It's out of the dilemma of this human condition, of this life that we all find ourselves in. And we'll continue on getting more into that exact question in the next session.